In quest of Poukawa Man. One detail that is bordered on top secret is the fact that human skeletons, or sundry human bones, were encountered deep down under the ancient ash layers at Poukawa, along with the cooked and broken up moa bones cast aside after the moa hunter feasts. In letters exchanged between Price and Rafter, especially, the term Poukawa Man is raised several times, and other insiders were privy to the information. This included local Maori, who authorised skeletal remains to be sent to the DSIR radiocarbon lab for age testing. Maori of the 1960s were obviously as inquisitive as everyone else as to who these old skeletons belonged. One advantage they had over non-Maori New Zealanders was that their old elders, recounting oral history, spoke openly about the strangers who had previously occupied lands that came into Maori possession. Historian anthropologist Edward Tregear wrote,
"The Maoris used to pay great respect to the bones of their dead, yet here and there may be found among sandhills, etc., human remains uncovered by the wind, and of these no tradition remains, as there would certainly be if the relics were those of ancestors. The natives say these are the bones of strangers. So also mortuary caves are found, concerning the contents of which the Maoris make the same remark and regard them with indifference."
On May 7, 1969, Price wrote the following to Athol Rafter.
"Many thanks for your helpful and encouraging letter of 24th of April. I have just finished packing the skeleton from Roy Natush's property. He has obtained the full approval of the 3 tribal committees concerned, and a permit from the police, so all is well. We have retained the lower jaw, quite good order considering, and what remains of the skull. When this lower jaw is compared with ours from Poukawa, it is at once observable that you are looking at 2 distinct types of man. Roy is obtaining medical evidence on this point. Unfortunately, right in the middle of this, his wife fell and broke her arm, so I volunteered to pack the skeleton, which he will pick up in a day or 2, and forward by road transport direct to you. I am going to recommend to him that he let you examine the jaw width, which I consider very important."
At the end of his May 7, 1969 letter, Price wrote cryptically about human skeletal finds.
"We were very pleased to hear your remarks re Northern interests, but thought it advisable to let you know just what these people had in mind. They are a crowd I have little interest in. I had a nice letter from Professor Charles Hyam, and he will visit us if possible, but like ourselves, time is the vital factor. I was delighted to hear of this success re early dates. They are on the right track. Feel sure they will recover more. P.S. With regards to Roy Natush's second skeleton, he has decided not to push his luck too far with the Maoris at present, and the same applies to our own. They are easily upset. In both cases, the skeletons can be used for comparative purposes. What I want is more human material in the way of a skeleton or scattered bone clearly below the ash showers."
On June 19, 1969, Price wrote the following to Athol Rafter.
"I have talked with Roy Natush and Kim Ramsey, and we are unanimous in the decision for you to take whatever steps you consider necessary in this vital matter of Roy's remarkable discovery, so you can move quickly and correctly to get scientific recognition for all the work that has been done by us all. I have gone over very carefully all the material Roy has sent you, and there can be no doubt in my mind that he has found an entirely different type of man, hitherto not found in New Zealand. When he first brought me the evidence which you are now dating, apart from its evident age, Once I examined that primitive and massive jaw, lower. I at once told him he really had something. As you say, the counter will tell the story.
Roy Natouche had found a giant skeleton, or parts thereof, which displayed a very large jaw. During the colonial era of New Zealand, many of these tall stature skeletons have been seen, especially on the west coast, ranging from Port Waikato to Mitimiti, a distance of 160 miles or 255 kilometres up the coastline. Anomalous skeletons like this, when found today, are given to local Maori tribes who destroy them. No scientific analysis is allowed. Athol Rafter wrote back on the 17th of June 1969.
We will start on the skeleton tomorrow, and as soon as we have this date, an assessment can be made of the whole area. If the collagen human date is what you expect, then a considerable amount of work will be warranted on your Poukawa site. We opened up the 2 skulls you kindly sent down. Poukawa Man, as you say, is of relatively modern vintage, but the other skull could easily be of a man living thousands of years ago in New Zealand. However, we cannot speculate but leave off now until the C14 age puts away all doubts. David Natouche has taken the skulls down to our photographer for record purposes. We will send you copies.
Athol Rafter wrote again to Russell Price on the 17th of June 1969.
Your letter of May 7 got lost for a time beneath my correspondence, and I have enclosed the papers you need. I am pleased you are going to write up a scientific paper with Mr. Puller. If the collagen age for the skeleton is in the order of 1,000 years, then I think you and Mr. Natouche should write a short account for Nature straight away. This should be no trouble. Another way of getting good publicity for your work is for reference to be made at the Anthropology Section meeting at ANZAAS in Adelaide next August. I think I told you I am chairman of a symposium at that meeting and would be happy to refer to your excellent work. If the collagen age is right, I will, with your permission, let Dr. McIntosh, the Professor of Anatomy, Sydney University, know and send him photos of the 2 skulls. I'm sure he will be on the next plane to Poukawa. These are just ideas in anticipation of the right result, but we need to move quickly and correctly to get you the scientific credit you deserve.
On November 3rd, 1969, Russell Price wrote a lengthy 3-page update on recent activities and concluded with,
David Buddo Farmer has given me authority to expel any undesired persons from our sites, and was delighted to hear that the Institute of Nuclear Sciences will do all it can to assist in the research for Poukawa Man. We all feel that Dr. Duff is a decidedly prejudiced person, and as a self-appointed judge is a bit of a flop. We shall continue with our work at Poukawa for a long time to come.
There were a number of archaeologists who seemed to, quite openly, resent Price's extraordinary finds, and Price had to try to sidestep their academic snobbery and rank-pulling condescension. One of these self-appointed prima donnas was Dr. Roger Duff, and when the plug was finally pulled by jealous or politically aligned adversaries, and Price's work and reputation went down the gurgler, he felt that a major architect of his demise was Dr. Roger Duff. About these down-in-the-mouth dissenters, Bernadette Noble of the Hawke's Bay newspaper wrote on May 1st, 1969.
I went to Hastings to meet Mr. Price and to see for myself the small 120 by 120 feet square that is causing such gnashing of teeth in high scientific places.
In reference to this weeping, wailing and gnashing of teeth in high scientific places, historian Michael King, who participated in a major way in Price's digs, wrote the following.
Evidence from the Poukawa excavations has driven another nail into the coffin of the storybook account of the colonisation of New Zealand. But to some it is too audacious to suggest that New Zealand was populated, however sparsely, more than 2,000 years ago. Russell Price is not deterred by the scepticism of his professional colleagues, Dr. Roger Duff of the Canterbury Museum and Mr. David Simmons of the Auckland Museum. They have cast doubt on his conclusions by suggesting that ancient moa bones on the site might have been deposited naturally and that 18th century Maoris might have dug up old bones for artefacts, that material might have fallen through the ash showers, and that the ash may have been artificially redeposited centuries after the Taupo and Waimea eruptions.
Speaking of Price's major enemies, this is a picture of ethnologist David Simmons. And once during a conversation with me about archaeology, he gave me a stern patriarchal stare and admonished me to let Maori history be anything that Maori wish it to be. In other words, allow it to be any kind of pseudo-historical fantasy they preferred, and don't question that approach. Whereas I felt valid history should reflect warts and all happenings, David advocated a more touchy-feely approach to historical interpretation. Another time over lunch at Auckland Institute and Museum coffee shop, I asked David about the anomalous plaited red hair that had been found at the Waitakere rock shelters. Sir Peter Buck had said that the hair samples were from the distant pre-Maori people. I'd seen them myself at Auckland Museum when I was a child, but they had long since been taken off display. David's answer to me was, "They're around here somewhere, but you'll never get to see them." In other words, they were out of sight, out of mind, and would remain so, as such evidence was now deemed counterproductive to the acceptable paradigm. This was the plan of action decided upon by both Duff and Simmons to torpedo Price's findings. A few years later, this plan was implemented by McFadyen. With authority given to Price by farmer David Buddo to expel undesirables, it's a pity he didn't give Bruce McFadyen the bum's rush in 1973.
New Zealanders came to within a hairbreadth of having access to their true long-term history, only to have it snatched away by the censors at the last minute. Valid, open and scientific approach archaeology is now non-existent in New Zealand, and hamstrung, hobbled archaeology is used in its place as a political weapon or propaganda device.
Here again is an example of where the modern-day Waikato University radiocarbon database has not been careful enough to strip out relevant information that contradicts the modern McFudged scientific point of view. Seen here, there is reference to human bones being found under the Taupo ash layer, which would make those human remains around 2,000 years old at least, which completely contradicts the new reporting convention requirements that there were no people in New Zealand prior to 700 years ago. Here is an example of a McFudged radiocarbon result, where the remains being found under 186 AD tephra ash had been dated around 2,000 years old. This is an example of highly significant information hidden in plain sight, as the dearth of relevant facts that should have been included make the unsuspecting public simply gloss over the data without realizing what was found. Here's an actual letter from Rafter with results related to one of the several human skeleton finds where the remains were lying on the Waimea ash band. On the 16th of June 1969, Dr. Athol Rafter, in doing C14 analysis on samples submitted by Price, paraphrases what Price wrote in reference to the samples. Note the dates of 3120 years and 3210 years before 1950 were returned in the sample ages. So close and yet so far, just when it looked like we were going to get full disclosure of our long-term history, the clobbering machine went into full swing and dashed our hopes. It was a resounding no from the control freak faction, and we were not permitted to have this forbidden knowledge. Thereafter, New Zealand archaeological research in this category was locked down, and such has been the case now for nigh on 50 years. Many New Zealanders would question why a government would wish to censor history in this way. By all appearances, it's a scourge that afflicts many Western countries, pushed by internationalists who use indigenous rights legislation as a main weapon of leverage in breaking the solidarity and sovereignty of especially Western nations. The United Nations foisted UNDRIP, that is, United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, onto New Zealand, thus dividing the country into at least two major interbickering factions. And a central theme that must be religiously advocated is that Maori are the only people to have ever occupied pre-colonial New Zealand. This flies in the face of everything that is within our history books, where copious mention is made of the much more ancient Moa hunters who inhabited New Zealand for thousands of years before the Polynesian Maori arrived. However, mere mention of this inconvenient recorded history sends the social engineers into a frenzy of tantrums, weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. Thus one group in society is empowered, while another is disenfranchised, allowing big corporations to gain access to rich resources that would not usually be so readily available in a country where sovereignty is fully intact and impregnable. So who was Poukawa Man? Back in the days when there were still vestiges of true archaeological research being undertaken in New Zealand, Lady Eileen Fox, renowned British archaeologist, came to New Zealand in retirement to study so-called Maori Hillforts. She was considered to be a leading world authority on Iron Age Hillforts of Britain and continental Europe. In 1972, she retired as senior lecturer in archaeology at the University of Exeter, England, and took up a position at Auckland University, New Zealand, to teach Romano-British and Celtic archaeology. Lady Fox was inspired to come to New Zealand by observations of anthropologist Sir Raymond Firth, who provided for the first volume of the English archaeological journal Antiquity in 1927, an article on Maori Hillforts. Other early writers she mentioned were Captain James Cook, Joseph Banks, Sidney Parkinson, Marion Dufresne, Croisette Leroux, Dumont d'Urville, Louis de Saison, Samuel Marsden, William Yate, Henry Williams, etc., to which we could add F.E. Manning and many more early writers who were mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of the hilltop excavations or number of these structures that dot the North Island landscape in their thousands. Mannings wrote,
"The old hill forts are, many of them, so large that an amount of labour must have been expended in trenching, terracing and fencing them, and all without iron tools, which increased the difficulty 100-fold. Which must have required a vastly greater population to accomplish than can now be found in the surrounding districts. These forts were also of such an extent that, taking into consideration the system of attack and defence used necessarily in those times, they would have been utterly untenable unless held by at least 10 times the number of men the whole surrounding district for 2 or 3 days' journey can produce. Now from the top of one of these pointed, trenched and terraced hills, I have counted 20 others, all of equally large dimensions, and all within a distance in every direction of 15 to 20 miles. And native tradition affirms that each of these hills was the stronghold of a separate hapu or clan, bearing its distinctive name. There is also the most unmistakable evidence of vast tracts of country which have lain wild, time out of mind, were once fully cultivated. Many collections of these provision stores, pits for sweet potato storage, have outlived Maori tradition, and the natives can only conjecture who they belong to. Out of the centre of one of them, which I have seen there, is now growing a kauri tree 120 feet high, and out of another a large totara.
Typical of the impression these massive hill forts had on new arrivees to New Zealand is a statement by Surveyor General Felton Matthew of the 1840 New Zealand colonial government of William Hobson, who wrote,
"There are several very singular hills rising boldly from the surrounding land, in shape and form closely resembling the Roman encampments on the tumuli that abound in many parts of England, and having like them 3 or 4 distinct fops or ditches encircling them towards the summit. This singular, too, that these have been formed for defence by the natives. The top of every hill is marked in this way with distinct lines of circumvallation. An antiquary might from this circumstance deduce a connection between the New Zealanders and the ancient Romans."
Another early explorer noted,
"Arriving at the foot of the mountain, we essayed its ascent, in the course of which my friend evinced a deep interest in traces of Maori fortifications of a past age, which were everywhere in evidence. The escarpments, trenches, and what had once been covered ways and store pits, though fallen in or overgrown, were yet in a wonderful state of recognition. Several of the stone walls of these fortifications could still be traced with considerable accuracy, although the oldest living Maori could not tell when or by whom they were erected. The Maori race show a wonderful aptitude for field engineering and warfare, and these traces of ancient fortifications in particular have often called forth the highest commendation from those most capable of judging such matters. It must have taken a much larger population than was then to be found to man these fortifications effectively. So extensive were they, the whole mountain appearing to be girt by them, line after line, from bottom to top."
In the foreword of Lady Eileen Fox's book, Prehistoric Maori Fortifications in the North Island of New Zealand, Dr. R.C. Green writes,
"Native New Zealanders, known collectively today as Maori, had Eastern Polynesians as ancestors. By the last half of the 18th century AD, they had developed in the course of a 1,000-year residence in New Zealand a variety of settlements, one of which, the fortified Pa, attracted the attention and admiration of early European visitors and inhabitants. This is not surprising. Many of these newcomers were of British origin. Often they had Celts as one or more of their ancestors, and in the last half of the first millennium BC, Celts too constructed hill forts very similar to some Maori Pa, and participated in a society which had a number of features in common with the Maori. Both indigenous groups, moreover, used their fortifications in facing up to invasion by newcomers, backed by a technologically more advanced civilization, Romans on the one hand, the British military on the other. Thus, despite an absence of any historical connection with the Celts, Maori fortifications have long been a fruitful source for commentary, comparison and speculation."
The comparisons extend well beyond the same or similar styles of forts construction, extending into very similar cultural symbolism, myths and legends, etc. In the North Island of New Zealand, there are an estimated 5,000 of these fort structures that sit to the north of Lake Taupo alone, whereas in Britain there are less than half that number in the whole country. Many of the so-called fort structures had no defensive capability and were simply the sites of small or large villages where extensive earthworks have been excavated solely for domestic convenience. An area of interest for Lady Eileen Fox was the Hawke's Bay district, where she and her teams undertook archaeological digs at Tirimoana, Te Awanga, only 17 miles, that is 27 kilometres northeast from Russell Price's main dig site in the Poukawa Valley. Lady Eileen Fox and her team found a wooden door slab that was exceptionally well preserved. The Rafter Laboratory carbon dated it to 3910 years old, or from 1960 BC. Let's touch upon one of the many such ancient structures that are found in the Poukawa Valley or up on the high ranges circumnavigating the valley. In preliminary discussions with farmer Bill Butto, we asked if there were any pre-colonial, or more ancient, hilltop structures in the valley that could have functioned as solar observatories. From experience in studying ancient community sites across New Zealand that predated the era of Maori occupation, invariably there will be solar observatories for taking time fixes on an equinox or solstice rise or set. Being as Russell Price was finding evidence of very ancient occupation within the valley, it seemed obligatory that there had to be a solar observatory somewhere nearby. As it turns out, there was one only half a kilometre northeast of Russell Price's dig site 1. The lozenge-shaped hilltop solar observatory in the Poukawa Valley, a famous English artefact from the Bronze Age called the Bush Barrow Lozenge. This is an AutoCAD scaled replica of the Bush Barrow Lozenge, which was found very near to Stonehenge in a tumulus mound grave and lying on the chest of a man of obvious importance. The lozenge was fabricated in thinly beaten gold sheet, and grave goods associated with the deceased suggested he was a priest forerunner to the latter Druids. One item in the grave was a plane table, anciently used in conjunction with an alidade sighting rule for accurate surveying of the landscape. Professor John North comments concerning particular survey-related grave goods found at Bush Barrow Tumulus Mound.
Fragments of wood that the excavators had thought were the remains of a shield were now described as the remains of an alidade, a sighting rule, and wooden drawing board or plane table.
So, by associating the ancient British lozenge design with surveying, are there any attributes of the Poukawa earthworks lozenge which show a surveying-related function? As it turns out, one point of the Poukawa multi-tiered earth mound lozenge orientates onto true north, with the other points orientating onto due east, due west, and due south. The original configuration of the site appears to have been quite similar in concept to a bush barrow lozenge shape, with concentric rising tiers as one moved further in towards the centre platform. It would seem that at latter eras, pits were dug across the surface for roofed dwellings, where people could live below the wind line. However, the evidence shows that the original builders had a surveying and solar observatory function in mind. The lozenge shape, superimposed over a Google Earth image, has its corners on the primary points of the compass. From the centre of the hilltop lozenge embankment, a line is seen to run for 2.33 miles to a set of purpose-placed obelisk boulders that mark due north. They sit in a row near the skyline of a high ridge and can be seen from the lozenge structure in reasonable weather. Ancient surveyors would have been able to fix their alidade sighting rule or plane table onto the true north marker, set a 360-degree disc to the 0 point, then read precise angles to any other target around the horizon. Here is the Google Earth lineup of the purpose-placed obelisks, the largest of which, to the left, marks due north. The others seem to have been placed to make the main marker more visually conspicuous and represent alternate shifts of the degree angle by 0.05 of a degree. There is no grouping of boulders like this in the immediate vicinity, and these have obviously been placed in that precise position by human intervention. Here is the line of anciently placed obelisks near the ridge top, with the biggest one in the foreground marking true north. It now lies recumbent, and cattle are obviously clambering around it. What would have once been chock boulders to form a stabilising cradle under the standing stone now lie about nearby in the mud. This is the ancient limestone obelisk, tumbled from its former position, but still indicating the position of due north from the centre of the lozenge structure in the valley. This is an aerial view of the now dishevelled and pitted stepped lozenge structure. The faint outlines of the rising concentric tiers can still be detected, but the ancient structure has been considerably dug over by the last Maori occupants who used it as a sentinel and defensive position during intertribal fighting. From the lozenge structure, the obelisk line marking due north would be on the top of the range as indicated by the arrow. This is yet another stepped, truncated pyramid in the Poukawa area, situated in the valley over the range, westwards of where the due north markers are set out at the top of the ridge. The farmer has fenced it to ensure that no cattle can disturb the four rising tiers. In a first assessment, it looks like it would work very well for a winter solstice sunrise fix, but the nearby ranges to the east and west should provide excellent fixes on the other major solar events throughout the year as well, for both rises and sets of the sun. Here is the vernal equinox sunrise 2019 from the centre of the lozenge earth mound. The long hill ranges to the east and west have distinctive troughs and humps, such that ancient astronomers who knew their terrain intimately could see when the sun arose perfectly on the outer marker geological feature that represented a fix for the equinox day. The long ranges provide the ability to get perfect fixes onto summer solstice, equinox and winter solstice rises and sets of the sun, such that calendar counts throughout the year would be accurate. This is the equinox sunset on the western range. By knowing elevation above sea level, where the sun emerged or alighted onto the ranges, as well as the diagonal angle of the rising or setting sun at the equinox, calculations were possible for determining true north. Amongst the many descriptions that have been passed down to us via Maori oral traditions, we have the following.
Besides gods, the natives believed in the existence of other beings who lived in communities, built paths, and were occupied with similar pursuits to those of men. These were called Patupaiarii. Their chief residences were on the tops of lofty hills, and they are said to have been the spiritual occupants of the country prior to the arrival of the Maori, and to retire as they advanced. The Wanganui natives state that when they first came to reside on the banks of the river, almost all the chief heights were occupied by the Patupaiarii, who gradually abandoned the river, and that even until a few generations ago they had their favourite haunts there. These may be accounts of an Aboriginal race mixed with fable. There are several things to warrant the idea that the Maori were not the first inhabitants of the land. The Patupaiarii were only seen early in the morning, and are represented as being white and clothed in white garments of the same form and texture as their own. In fact, they may be called the children of the mist. They are supposed to be of large size and may be regarded as giants, although in some respects they resemble our fairies. They are seldom seen alone, but generally in large numbers. They are loud speakers and delight in playing on the putarino flute. They are said to nurse their children in their arms, the same as Europeans, and not to carry them, in the Maori style, on the back or hip. Their faces are papatia, not tattooed, and in this respect also they resemble Europeans. They hold long councils and sing very loud. They often go and sit in cultivations which are completely filled with them, so as to be frequently mistaken for a war party, but they never injure the ground. The belief in the Patupaiarii is very general. Many have affirmed to me that they have repeatedly met with them. Albinos are said to be their offspring, and they are accused of frequently surprising women in the bush.
Disgraced with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Even these Another kind of structure that one would expect to find where ancient communities were large in number is the bowl-type amphitheatre. It seems to have been a common practice amongst the ancient inhabitants of New Zealand to modify natural bowl-like land features into semi-terraced or smooth-ground amphitheatres, where the acoustics were very much improved and people could gather together for storytelling, oratory, music, dance displays, general entertainment, as well as councils, etc. These large, symmetrical, amphitheatre-like features are found in many locations across New Zealand where sizable ancient communities are known to have resided. And sometimes there will be side-by-side amphitheatres where the communities were particularly large. This is the case in the Poukawa Valley. These symmetrical hillside bowl depressions in the Poukawa landscape would once have sat at the lake edge, with the lapping shoreline water sufficiently low to provide solid ground trackway access to the natural or semi-natural amphitheatres. These two probable amphitheatres, and a much smaller third one to the west, would have been ideal for community social gatherings, oratory and entertainment. Some of these amphitheatres around New Zealand had centrally built elongated mounds strategically placed for line dancing displays or oratory, where the speakers or musicians could project very effectively and audibly to the encircling audience. This is a view of the largest Poukawa amphitheatre, looking south to the lake centre from the rear of the bowl rim. Note the small pinched-together entrance, effectively sheltering the gathered-in occupants from the prevailing wind. Speakers or performers could stand near the entryway or more centrally to face and interact with their audience. Another large amphitheatre bowl at Te Papakanga Park, Oriri Point, towards Thames, New Zealand, where there was once a large community of Patupaiarehe, the umbrella term used by Maori to relate to the people they found in New Zealand when they arrived in 1300 AD. Maori oral traditions speak of these people being vanquished and forced to flee to the nearby Coromandel Ranges. There are two such amphitheatres at Te Papakanga Park. This one has a raised central mound that would have worked well for orators or musician-singers to stand upon when performing their arts before the encircling audience.
Lovely hula hands, graceful as the birds in motion, gliding like the gulls over the ocean. Lovely hula hands, kolimananie. Lovely hula hands, telling of the rain in the valley, and the swirling wind over the pali. Lovely hula hands, kolimananie.
One unsupportable hangover conclusion, pushed to this very day by classicist isolationist historians, is that Great Britain was a very backwards nation until the invading Roman armies brought civilization in 43 AD. The many Celtic tribes and other Britons occupying the British Isles at the time of the Roman invasion are, for the most part, represented as the great unwashed and filthy, uneducated savages dressed in animal skins and living in mud huts. Nothing could be further from the truth. Historian Isabel Hill Elder wrote, "There are many perversions of truth relative to the past which the British people have long since settled down to believe, with the result that the modern skeptic hastens to cover with the chilling mantle of disbelief any attempt to present a true account of early British affairs. In 56 BC, 220 huge Celtic swan ships, many of them from Britain, turned up to do battle with the Roman oared ship, that is biremes and triremes, at the Loire estuary of Gaul during the Roman invasion. The Celtic sailing ships were winning the battle resoundingly until the wind died. You can read all about it in De Bello Gallico by Julius Caesar, who witnessed the entire thing. In 55 BC, the invading Roman army were chased off the beaches of Kent by Celtic war chariots that had driven on fully formed roads to get to the battle point. The roads of Britain were not Roman roads at all necessarily, but were built by King Molamutus and his son Belinus in 400 BC. When the Roman armies finally managed to get a foothold in Britain, they had their own historians in attendance with them. These individuals wrote about the great abundance of crops and variety of goods within the fields and marketplaces, as well as the advanced abilities of British artisans to fabricate such items as enamelware. They noted that each large city, of which there were about 60 in Roman-occupied Britain, had its own university. They also mentioned that there were about 40 Druidic schools, these are open-air universities, using the standing stones and henge sites, and it eventually became common practice for the Roman aristocracy to send their children to Britain for an education. Julius Caesar commented on the great open-air universities of Britain that existed circa 56 BC, 100 years before the Roman invasion. He wrote, "The students of these colleges numbered, at times, 60,000 of the youth and young nobility of Britain and Gaul." Caesar comments on the fact that the Gauls sent their youth to Britain to be educated. It required 20 years to master the complete circle of Druidic knowledge: natural philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, geometry, medicine, jurisprudence, poetry and oratory were all proposed and taught. Natural philosophy and astronomy with severe exactitude. For this you can read the work of Isabel Hill Elder, who refers to Strabo and various other people who commented on this. The many ancient earth-mound amphitheatres that dot the landscapes of Britain are not Roman in origin, although misrepresented by the classicist historians so to be. In design concept, they are like the ancient henge embankments of Britain, with a heritage stemming from the Bronze Age, long before Roman civilization even existed. The same holds true of the many plan and quarry, that is, flat field and quarried walls embanked circles across Britain, where plays and festivals were held since time immemorial.
A great deal of history, so-called, has come down to us from Latin sources, whose one object was from the very first to make us believe that we owe all to Rome, when in fact Rome owes a great deal to us. So much error has been taught in our schools concerning the ancient Britons, that it is difficult for the average student to realize that the British, before the arrival of Julius Caesar, were in all probability among the most highly educated people on earth at that time, and as regards scientific research surpassed both the Greeks and Romans, a fact testified to by the Greek and Roman writers themselves. In all the solid essentials of humanity, our British ancestors compare to great advantage with the best eras of Greece and Rome.